All right, good afternoon. We are pleased we have Carrie Christofes. I'm just going to read her quick bio and turn it over to Carrie. But Carrie started her professional career in law enforcement, having transitioned into prevention, coalition, and grants management work. She has over 15 years of experience in the development, direction, and management of substance use disorder prevention programming at the local level, as well as managing grants at the state and federal levels. She is currently the executive director of the National Liquor Law Enforcement Association, a nonprofit association of law enforcement personnel dedicated to enforcement of liquor laws and regulations. All right, Carrie, you've got the floor. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see that. If not, you'll have to speak up and let me know. So welcome. As Mike said, I'm Carrie Christofes. I'm the Executive Director for the National Liquor Law Enforcement Association. I'm going to talk to you today about the role of law enforcement and public health as it relates to compliance of alcohol sales and deliveries, and how the NLLEA supports collaboration to effectively maintain a safe and healthy alcohol marketplace. So for those of you that might not be familiar with the NLLEA, we are a nonprofit association of law enforcement personnel from across the United States and Canada. We're dedicated to the enforcement of liquor laws and regulations. So our main function is we ensure that alcoholic beverages are promoted, distributed, and consumed in a legal fashion. And we enhance the understanding and importance of liquor law enforcement in preventing crime and community problems. So we're truly committed to improving the standards and best practices of liquor law enforcement. So Mike did read my bio, but yes, I started out in enforcement, and then I moved on to prevention, and there's some of the places that I've worked. I'm from Pennsylvania, and now I'm into, alcohol enforcement as well, and regulation. So I'd like to think that I've come full circle with my career. And when I started in prevention, I started out as a prevention coordinator with the Enforcing the Underage Drinking Laws grants, the old UDL grants. And I coordinated that grant and ran that grant. And I also had a drug-free communities grant and a STOP Act grant. So it's great to be kind of back in the field and working with a lot of the same names that I saw years ago in working those grants. I also worked to get local grants for our enforcement and helped put together an underage drinking task force, where our main function for the UDL grant was doing alcohol compliance checks. So when you're looking at alcohol law enforcement, we like to think of ourselves as the national voice with expertise on all matters dealing with alcohol law enforcement. We have trainers that are subject matter experts in alcohol law enforcement, and we promote best practices in alcohol law enforcement. So when we think about enforcement of liquor laws, we tend to focus on, age compliance checks, underage drinking and driving, but there truly is a whole other gambit of responsibilities that alcohol law enforcement has. And that can run anywhere from tobacco enforcement to also illegal gambling, also cannabis enforcement, and also human trafficking. So I put all these bubbles together. I ran out of space, but we do a lot. And in doing a lot, one of the most important things is the communication and information sharing among agencies. So whether that be between our state police, our local police, and then also alcohol regulatory. And there's some other entities on there that you might not think that we work with, but also, state health departments, zoning. We also, work with our tax related offices. as well to ensure compliance in auditing. So in looking at alcohol law enforcement and compliance, depending on how your state is set up, who has the main responsibility over compliance checks. That could be state, that could be local, that could be a combination of both. And I believe in Michigan, that is a combination of both. So, we want to be sure that each entity is communicating and collaborating on their enforcement efforts and also on their findings. Compliance of liquor establishments usually starts with inspections. And that may be an inspection of whether it's an on-premise, like a restaurant, or a place that does off-premise sales, like possibly a grocery store or a bar. And nowadays we're seeing a whole lot of other places doing off-premise sales of alcohol, especially with alcohol to go. So, we start out with, kind of like a regular routine compliance. And then that can lead into other compliance we're going to talk about with the alcohol compliance checks. So most states have protocols for their compliance checks and their underage decoys, and Michigan does. And if you check out their website, there's some of those compliance protocols are on there and how they use your student decoys. So that can include things too. I know we collect data on that for the STOP Act report on state protocols and how those are set up. So states can use, underage buyers that might be anywhere from 18 to 20 years old. Other states may have other minimum and maximum age requirements. Other requirements as far as, are they allowed to lie about their age when they're doing the compliance checks? Or how are they supposed to dress? Are they supposed to show their identification if asked? So each state has their own protocols on that. States also have penalty guidelines. Again, this is from the 2018 STOP Act report to Congress. It is the most recent report available on the website. So this is looking at 2017 data for penalty guidelines and what states have those guidelines and what states don't. And you'll see that Michigan does have guidelines for the sales and service to minors, and penalty guidelines that establish firm and relatively severe penalties, particularly for repeat offenders, that can increase the deterrent effect of policy, and its enforcement can increase licensees' awareness of the risks associated with violations. So, when you're looking at this map, you can see the different states that have penalty guidelines and some that don't. And this may have changed. As I said, this is 2017 data. So also, we want to look at, what is our trend data over time? And this is, again, from the STOP Act report, and you can see my arrow in Michigan at the bottom. So this is a 5-year trend data for compliance checks. And these were probably what was reported by the state. I don't believe it was local law enforcement. And I realize sometimes it's hard to fully collect all of that data across the board and how it's being reported. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Some of the challenges that entities have with collecting that data across the board. So as you can see, with age compliance checks, why do we do these age compliance checks? The simple answer would be to prevent youth from accessing alcohol and prevent underage drinking. But for each state or community, when determining where to place your prevention dollars, which is important these days, an assessment is completed to determine, where is your high risk substance use problems? And it sounds like Michigan's already done that, and they've identified the need for compliance checks and written those into your plan. And so those may be, done collectively through, youth surveys to determine where your problem areas are. Underage arrest data, hospital admissions data, treatment data would inform you, where youth have access to alcohol. But we're also talking about how are they acquiring it. We might know that they have access to it and they're using it, but are they getting it at your local bars and restaurants? So we really need to be looking at the but why and the but why here. And, as I move on, if you're familiar with any of the CADCA coalition primers, we talk about problem analysis and the but why and the but why here, and really narrowing down for our communities where youth are getting alcohol. And is it from retailers? Maybe it's from home. Maybe it's from an older friend or at parties. So, once that's established, then we can really start looking at our baseline data, if we have any trend data, to really speak to why we are doing these compliance checks. So, we're going to talk about the effectiveness of compliance checks and what we need to be looking at. And for the effectiveness of compliance checks, they need to be done regularly, they need to be done comprehensively, and they need to be done consistently. And in the STOP Act report, there is a lot of information about this, and there's a lot of studies, because there were several studies completed about the effectiveness of compliance checks. And you can take a look at those and probably pull even more specific data on, the regularity of how they should be completed. But when we're talking about consistency, we're talking about checking all outlets in a jurisdiction. So, narrowing down, maybe you're looking at a region, maybe you're looking at a county, maybe you're looking at a community. So you really need to get that baseline data and try to do at least one check in all of your outlets. Having the checks done at least 3 to 4 times a year. So if they could be done quarterly, that would be the most effective. And then conducting those follow-up checks on places that have been non-compliant to make sure that you're consistently checking them, but also there might be that need for some re-education with their servers and their sellers. So that's important too, to be getting that education out there. I know with the COVID pandemic, states may have put their compliance checks on hold due to safety considerations for their adult and youth decoys doing the checks. So, depending on where your state's at right now, I know some states are fully open, some states are not. Some states are getting back into doing the compliance checks full force, and some states just aren't there yet. So, once we get back to being able to do those compliance checks in full force, really looking at our resources that are available to do those. And I know a lot of times it can be reality of our resources, as opposed to, what the research tells us we should be doing. So we have to factor in our capacity to do those checks as well. Also, in doing the compliance checks, when they're partnered up with a media campaign, that can be very helpful. It brings public awareness of the enforcement efforts. So not only a media campaign that might announce that you're doing the compliance checks, but then also a media campaign that puts out the statistics of your compliance checks, and maybe even puts in the paper or on the local radio. And I know there's a lot of other media sources these days with Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, but what places have failed. So it becomes a deterrent for others. So, you're looking at your perception of risk of arrest and your perception of risk of sanctions. So really documenting that and getting the word out there. So our main goal with compliance checks is to prevent youth from accessing alcohol. Also to prevent our licensed establishments from serving youth alcohol, to deter that behavior from both angles so that our licensed establishments are checking IDs on a regular basis and know how to check IDs, and that our youth are getting the information that if they try to buy alcohol, they will be caught. Also, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, there's some other means to do compliance if maybe law enforcement isn't allowed to do the compliance checks right now with some safety guidelines that are in place. There's also the mystery shop program. And I believe Michigan is familiar with mystery shop, or at least have some familiarity with it. So that's when you are using somebody 21 years of age or older. I think they usually use between ages 21 to 25. And you can check on your licensed establishments in that way too. So it's kind of a checklist that you're going through. You want to make sure that they're checking ID. And this is just an example. Montgomery County Alcohol Beverage Services out of Maryland did a mystery shop program for their curbside and to-go orders, because they wanted to see how this new availability of alcohol was working in their communities. So, they were checking to see if IDs were checked when the order was picked up, if IDs were checked upon placing the order. So whether that was an online order and it asked the person's age, or whether that was a telephone order and they asked the person's age. And then there were some also other variables that went into that. So the types of containers for to-go alcohol beverages that were being used. And again, every state has their own guidelines on how that alcohol is supposed to be sealed and packaged. So they were looking at that as well. Also with some of the to-go orders and curbside, I know some states were communicating that the server or the wait staff that was bringing maybe the alcohol out curbside to the vehicle in different states have different regulations around how old that person has to be. Some states may have been using one of their teen staff that were there to bus tables to bring the alcohol curbside. And if they were maybe under the age of 18, then that would have been a violation. So there's some other things to be looking for as well. Also, another means is through the alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs section of the American Public Health Association, also the Alcohol Action Network. They have a tool available, and I can only speak to this very little, but if you email the leadership at apha/atod.org, and that's here on this slide, and maybe somebody could put that into the chat, but they have a resource observational tool available that they've created for coalitions to use to monitor alcohol home deliveries and curbside pickup. So it's a lot like the mystery shop, and it allows you to go through a checklist and make sure that all the regulations and the variables that they're looking at when checking ID are being done in those as well. And again, it would be somebody that would be 21 years of age or older doing those checks. So a coalition could do that. But when doing that, and just coming from a law enforcement background, it's good to have that communication with your law enforcement to know that you have a coalition that's out there and that they're doing that kind of work. It's just always good to notify each other of what the other person's doing. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. We're still going to talk compliance, but in the alcohol policy landscape and a lot of the challenges that we've had with the COVID-19 pandemic, some states saw a sharp increase in the careless delivery of alcoholic beverages to minors. And some are now seeing those relaxed temporary provisions become permanent or set to become permanent. And some states have even, put in their legislative regulations on those that they're asking that data be collected on how that's working, whether they've extended curbside pickup or alcohol to go, they want to see how that's working. So maybe they put a 2-year extension on that, allowing there to be an impact study on that. And that's something too that coalitions can help out with, is to collect that data on those impact studies. But we've had a lot of challenges, and I say we, alcohol law enforcement, with the expansion of access points, with alcohol law enforcement capacity. Do we have enough personnel to cover all these new access points? With educating, a lot of the regulations were passed without a lot of education around those new regulations, the compliance around that, and then also how are we monitoring all of that through our compliance. So we put out a best practice guidance document that talks about alcohol to go, home delivery, curbside pickup, and some compliance around that. So that's on our website at NLLEA.org if you want to check that out. So with the expansion of access points, we're talking about home delivery, cocktails to go, curbside pickup, and even with curbside pickup, how is that alcohol allowed to be transported in the vehicle? Is it supposed to be, in most cases, it's supposed to be out of the reach of the driver or in the trunk? Again, how is that alcohol being sealed? In a lot of cases, when these regulations were first put out, it was like, oh, well, we'll just put a piece of tape over the drink hole. And I believe that regulation has got a lot, I would say, smarter around that, but I think they've, now that they have more resources available to them, they're, requiring alcohol to go to be in sealed packages, whether that be with some type of laminate or sealing agent. So that's more helpful. So if somebody is pulled over, then law enforcement will know whether that alcohol has, if the seal is broken, whether it's been used. Also, with expansion of access points, we're seeing expansion of landscape. So increased alcohol access points with how and where alcohol is allowed to be consumed. Most restaurants, if they did not already have outdoor dining, they made adaptations to their businesses to allow for that, which in some cases may have included roping off, a section, maybe even in their parking lot, or city ordinance allowing for an entertainment district. So we're seeing alcohol now being allowed in more non-traditional settings like parks and outdoor festivals, and also the transition of permitting to allow for more off-premise sales of alcohol in establishments like restaurants that are typically only allowed for alcohol or for on-premise consumption. So what does the age compliance checks look like around those new settings? And are we doing them, and how can they be done, and how can we start having those conversations with our law enforcement around that? We're looking at alcohol outlets per enforcement agent. And I just bring this up because capacity is a huge issue. When looking at enforcement, do we have enough people to enforce the compliance around all these new access points? In 2019, the NLLEA had conducted a survey, and within that survey, we had asked a question around the number of agents per the total number of licensed alcohol outlets. So this is just a small sample of 20 agencies. So on average, one enforcement agent has a caseload of approximately 200 to 300 alcohol outlets. Now, nationally, the reports are one agent for every 557 outlets. So now on top of that, let's add in home delivery of alcohol and how resource intensive those compliance checks can be and the different access points. So we are definitely at capacity level, and there's just a lot going on. So anything the coalitions can do to help with that enforcement, I think would be greatly appreciated in each community. So I'm going to talk briefly about 2 different age compliance checks. Now, these are around home delivery, and I bring up home delivery just because it's a new trend for us and where we're headed in a lot of states with alcohol. And this was a alcohol compliance check out of the state of North Carolina. It was North Carolina Alcohol Law Enforcement. Their special agents conducted 18 compliance checks. Now, this was prior to COVID. This was done, I believe, let me check my notes here. It was done, I believe, in 2018, 2019. So out of 18 compliance checks conducted, they had a total of 5 cells, which attributed to the 27.78% of failure rate. They also, though, documented, you'll see another 5 handed alcohol, but then retrieved it. So they use this data to train their licensed establishments and show them, hey, this is what's going on when you have contracted with a third-party provider to deliver alcohol for your licensed establishment. So in some cases, you know, the delivery person handed the alcohol to the underage buyer, then swiped their ID and realized they were underage and took that alcohol back. So that didn't count as a sale, but it still counted towards this is something that we need to train people better on. So, and moving to this next slide, I'm going to play a video for you of one of the age compliance checks. They did record these checks, which was great because then they were able to show these recordings to their licensed establishments and what was actually being done. And these are things that they would not see and may not even be reported to them. And then also make recommendations for further training. So you may want to adjust your volume because they do talk a little bit low in this video.
Hi.
Do you have your ID? Yeah, mine's not scanning, so I have to.
Okay.
So you're not 21.
No,
So whose ID am I delivering it to that's 21?
that's supposed to be me.
How can you buy beer if you're not 21?
I guess I can't.
Well, it's getting me in trouble, but I guess I'll just enter my ID in there.
Okay.
You really can't do that. I could get in a lot of trouble for that. So I do not feel like returning it. She's worked with me in my information before, so let's see. 99, so that would mean you're turning 21. How old are you?
2 years. 19.
No one else would probably have done this, but hope I don't get in trouble. Don't do anything crazy.
Okay.
Hey, how you doing? I'm Special Agent Stemple with Alcohol Law Enforcement. How are you doing today? Let's step back in here and talk for a second. You know he's underage. Let's step back in here and talk for a second.
Was he underage?
Yeah, you scanned his ID and you told him, hey, I know that you're not 21. Whose card did you use? Whose date of birth am I
Yeah, it
supposed to be
was a
looking at?
different name. He's not 21.
No, and you checked his ID and you confirmed he wasn't 21. But listen, today I'm not going to write you a ticket. I'm not going to take you to jail. Right now we're doing
Why
this
are they doing this? Why would they
to
do
prevent something like this from happening
So
in the
he-
future.
this
He's
is
working
like-
with us. Okay.
I've never done that before, but I didn't want to have to go all the way back and return. I shouldn't have did it.
Okay.
Okay, so hopefully you all could hear that and see what was going on. She checked his ID and swiped it, saw that he was under 21, didn't want to go through the hassle of returning the alcohol to the store. And so she swiped her own ID, which bypassed the system and provided the alcohol to him. Again, this was done as a study, so there were no citations, but this gave North Carolina a picture, a good picture of what's going on with the delivery of alcohol and compliance. So again, in their recommendations, they did some retraining on checking identification before relinquishing custody of the alcoholic beverage. They also had an instance where the courier or delivery person had a misdemeanor controlled substance conviction within the previous 2 years and would also be considered unsuitable pursuant to their North Carolina statutes to even be able to deliver alcohol or handle alcohol. So that's something else to consider, in working compliance checks. So performing background investigations and reminding licensed establishments to do that. Again, hiring trustworthy employees, ensure employees know incentives for refusing a sell. They had learned that if this employee had telephoned their respective company, they would have received a $15 bonus for refusing to complete the sell and then returning that alcohol. So, working with those delivery services and finding out maybe if they do have some incentives and training that's going on and working with them as well can also add to your compliance. Okay, so another compliance check that we're going to look at was done in California. And this was by the California Alcoholic Beverage Control Delivery Decoy Program. So when COVID-19 forced the shutdown of the licensed establishments in California, this affected approximately 49,000 licensees in California. So again, food and alcohol became, to-go food and alcohol became the lifeline for these places. And law enforcement started receiving complaints of alcohol being left on doorsteps and being delivered to minors. So they had to act quickly and put together their home compliance decoy program. So a lot of times, we might be in a reactive mode as opposed to a proactive mode. And that's where this kind of left California and a lot of other states with the COVID-19 when they lifted some of these, alcohol access points. So as you can see, this was just a first round of checks. Out of 782 checks, they had 317 that delivered alcohol to a minor. Out of that 317, they wrote 229 citations. And the reason there's a difference in the number there is they found out that some of the couriers or delivery service personnel didn't even know that alcohol was in their order. By the way, the food order was packaged with the alcohol, it wasn't evident that there was alcohol, and they thought that they were only delivering food. So there was a lot of education that needed to be had in these deliveries. And that's exactly what they did. Now, they did cite some of the delivery drivers. They cited licensed establishments. They did a lot of education around this too. So over a 9-month period, so these numbers do not reflect this 79 to 17. This was over their 9-month period. They went from a 79% failure rate down to a 17% failure rate, which was really good that they were able to bring, the delivery services into compliance that quickly and do the education that they needed to. And in doing some of the education, some of the licensed establishments just realized that they didn't have the correct policies and protocols or business model in place to be doing deliveries at that time. So they stopped doing alcohol deliveries because, it was going to affect their license. So with the alcohol deliveries for home delivery, there's a lot to consider because they're very different from the brick and mortar compliance checks. You know, in North Carolina, they were able to get an apartment in an apartment complex for free. With California, they had to rent a hotel room. So there's some cost with the renting of the hotel room. There's also some cost around the transactions because you're ordering food and not just alcohol. And usually when you're doing a compliance check in a licensed establishment, you're just ordering the alcohol. There's fees associated with sometimes with ordering online. They needed more agents on per team for these checks because, you know, they needed an agent to make sure that the underage decoy was safe, doing follow-up with the driver that delivered the alcohol, recording the transaction, and that could have been, you know, whether they were transcribing or also video recording. And they also recorded, you know, how those orders were processed, whether they were done online, whether they were done over the phone, if they were asked their age at, you know, inception at the time of order, securing the evidence. So any of the alcohol they had to secure, they had to make sure the perimeter was safe. So if you're in, you know, a hotel or an apartment complex, it's a little more work for police to make sure that that full perimeter is safe. And then also following up with the licensee to ensure that they knew that that alcohol was delivered to a minor and making sure they had the right policies and protocols in place. So if you're working with law enforcement and you have maybe some grant funding through your coalition, I know, you know, it's hard to pay for officer overtime to do these types of checks, but here are some other factors that possibly grant funding could go to when considering compliance checks. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, you know, how we're collecting all of this data and how we can communicate among enforcement agencies, because I know that that can be a real challenge, especially when local law enforcement are doing compliance checks and your, you know, your state regulatory or your state police are doing compliance checks as well. And how are we getting all of this data and who's keeping track of it? And, you know, that can be really cumbersome sometimes. So one of the projects that the NLLEA has, and also we're working on this with NABCA, as I know Mike previously mentioned, Cassie Torre from NABCA, is a record management systems for alcohol law enforcement. So, you know, we're really looking at how the platforms that alcohol law enforcement are using to collect the data, how that can be shared with local law enforcement and how local law enforcement can share their data with alcohol law enforcement. You know, in June of 2019, there was a US Supreme Court case in which Justice Alito set precedents in his opinion. And that was in the Tennessee Wine and Spirits Retailers Association versus Thomas case. And he ruled in favor of the Wine and Spirits Retailers Association. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about that case, but with that landmark ruling, it has required alcohol law enforcement and the larger alcohol regulatory community to recognize that in order to maintain alcohol regulatory controls, data collection will be crucial and critical to documenting the rationale basis for alcohol regulation. We can't just say that this affects, you know, alcohol regulation without showing the data and backing it up with the data. So the enforcement of these regulations to substantiate their nexus to protecting the public health from harm. We really need to show our data. So informing alcohol regulation and policy, we know data collection is the critical nexus between alcohol and public health. So we're looking at that through an assessment of our record management systems, like I had mentioned, through our platforms, how we collect that data, all the variables that are collected. So are we capturing our alcohol compliance checks? Are we capturing our inspections, and what are we finding in those inspections? How are we coordinating and sharing that information among agencies, so that if a licensee is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, how is that getting up to the licensing board to make decisions as to whether that licensee may need to be suspended or not suspended, or may need to have some type of violation or some type of re-education in an area, especially if we have several entities working with our licensed establishments. We want to make sure that that information is getting to the proper people. So in the end of this project, we're still in the midst of it. We hope to have a guidance document with some recommendations on how record management can go forward with that sharing of information among alcohol law enforcement and alcohol regulatory bodies. Another avenue of collecting data that I wanted to share with everybody is out of the state of Vermont. It's the Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery, Division of Liquor Control. It's out of their Office of Compliance and Enforcement. They have what's called Project Rabbit, and Rabbit stands for Resource Allocation Based on Intelligence Toolkit. So this is a data-driven decision-making model. It is a data dashboard that is public-facing, and it's housed on their website. So if you go to Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery, you can see this dashboard. And it is accessible to their investigators and through their computers. It's also accessible on their smartphones, but it is accessible to the general public as well, which is huge. So coalitions can use this data. They can see in real time their inspection data. They can see in real time their age compliance checks data. So when you go to their dashboard, you would see on the opening page, it would automatically populate a list of the top 3 licensees with the greatest number of incidents for that day. So individual investigators are able to pull up their assigned areas or regions. They can pull up their data. And in a pull down menu, they can immediately see their top 3 establishments for their area in terms of violations. And that may be an overlay of violations from compliance checks to DUI, and then they know, okay, well, this is where I need to focus for the day. You know, in the past, they reported getting this huge binder, and it had all their alcohol establishments in this binder for their, you know, area or region, and their job was to go through each one and do an age compliance check or do an inspection. And they took those, you know, out of the binder as they did it, and, you know, then their binder would go down. But then at the start of the new year, they would just get another binder. So this eliminates some of that we're just doing to do it. Now we're actually focusing efforts on where the need is based on some violation data, and they can really allocate their resources better to do enforcement, which is huge in where we're at today with, you know, dwindling budgets. So I just wanted to share that with you. So balancing public health and alcohol regulation, there's a lot going on. I know we covered, you know, home delivery, some curbside pickup, cocktails to go, you know, the checking of IDs, and that was something new too with COVID, you know, something to be aware of with compliance checks as well as the wearing of masks and how to properly train staff to check IDs if somebody was wearing a mask. Age compliance checks, also COVID-19 compliance checks. A lot of alcohol law enforcement were responsible for those as well. And the expansion of our consumer landscape. And now that some places are opening back up and we're seeing larger influx of crowds, we're seeing increased violence as well. So constantly, you know, how are we balancing that public health and alcohol regulation, and ensuring that we're working together and sharing the information. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about NLLEA and our membership as I close out today. Our members mainly consist of alcohol law enforcement agencies. We have about 41 states represented. We also have individual memberships for alcohol law enforcement as well, but we do have an associate membership base too. So for non-law enforcement entities that want to have access to our information, to our trainings that we provide, or maybe they work closely with alcohol law enforcement that may not have the resources, or just law enforcement, local law enforcement that might not have the resources to join or get on and download a training. Coalitions could be helpful in that aspect. Some of our membership benefits: we do a training symposium each year, which currently we had done one back in May, and all of those are on our website at nllea.org. So if any members can access that for free with their membership. We also have a virtual training series that we keep up to date. So anything on checking IDs to, doing some undercover investigations, we have on there. We also have a chiefs meeting. We do those every other month. Again, it's a great way to collaborate and network and share information among our states. We also have and I don't have this on here, but a direct-to-consumer work group, which we are working a lot around the direct shipping of alcohol with that work group. And I know Michigan has been a leader in that area as well. We also provide best practice guidance documents and toolkits and resources, and those are usually available to the general public, so you can get on our website and check those out. And we also do an annual conference. We have an awards program. So if you are an entity that's non-law enforcement, you can, nominate your coalition. If you're working with any law enforcement entity that, you have a program that demonstrates effectiveness around alcohol compliance, even tobacco compliance, we invite you to nominate your coalition for that award. And we do give those awards out at our yearly annual meeting, which at our conference this year, it'll be in November. So if you get on our website, you can download the application for that. And those are actually due here at the end of the month. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out and ask me about that program as well. So we want to give recognition to those entities, those coalitions, those public health groups that are doing great work around our mission. We do have a conference coming up. It will be in person. It's in Montgomery, Alabama this year. And I invite all of you, if you're able to attend, or if you have funding to send some of your coalition members or even some local law enforcement to that conference, that would be great. The agenda is on our website, so you can check out the workshops that we have available for that. So I just wanted to share that with you. And I just want to thank you for listening today. And if you have any questions or need more information, there is my contact information. I'm going to stop, and I think we are going to open it up for Q&A. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. I'm going to stop the record button.